It's happening again, folks, and this time it's still horrible, as CA seems to be hurting more than ever. You might have noticed that I've been a bit absent from Total War as of late, and the reason is simple. It's frankly been kind of tough to understand where the series is going after the horrible show that was CA's entire 2023. I covered extensively how CA has failed to meet the expectations of a big part of its player base throughout the past 5 to 10 years in particular, and how it's all culminated in some frankly bizarre results. I mean, even though I personally didn't love games like 3K or the Warhammer series all that much, despite being able to see their merits, those games still did incredibly well for CA. Like, those player numbers don't lie, and all of the Total War YouTubers that have benefited greatly off of this new brand of CA, and the positivity of the CA subreddit and whatnot, speaks to a series that in some ways, in terms of overall popularity, at least among a new audience, was arguably doing better than ever. Knowing this, and knowing that Warhammer 2 was so beloved, and seeing the hype for Warhammer 3 just 2 years ago, I don't think anyone could have guessed just how much CA was able to kick itself in the shins and practically tear it all down in the matter of a single year. If the job losses and cuts at Creative Assembly following the failed Hyenas project last year wasn't enough, Eurogamer reports that SEGA is cutting a further 240 positions across its European studios, with the majority of those job losses being at Creative Assembly, both at HQ and at CA Sofia. This follows a trend in the games industry throughout the past year and a half, where thousands of developers have lost their jobs in the corporate publisher's pursuit of ever-increasing growth and profits. And always, bar none, this hurts the workers, those actually making our games and this universe of ours possible. It's a crying shame is what it is, and in the grand scheme of things, I don't know if we can for sure say whether CA's own failings as they relate to Total War are to blame here, other than that whole Hyenas thing of course, because we've seen elsewhere that profitable developers have been forced to cut positions despite, again, being profitable. And Total War is profitable. When I first read this headline, my heart kinda sank honestly. Creative Assembly as a studio means a lot to me. It's not only been a big part of my life in terms of passions, inspirations, and even my professional life, as this video is proof of. Despite my belief that CA has for the most part made Total War worse over the past decade, there's always that chance of redemption, or at the very least that they might create a good foundation for modders to fix, as has been the case for many of their titles to be honest. CA fully dying would be a true end of an era of not just strategy gaming, but gaming as a whole, and indeed turn a chapter in my own life, and I'm sure in many of the people watching this video's lives as well, for better or worse. Luckily, I don't think we're quite there yet. IGN also reported on this news, but received a follow-up update from SEGA, who stated that Creative Assembly continues to have multiple projects in development with Total War and a new unannounced project. Now that was good to read, since it means that we will indeed see more from CA in the future. Of course, working with fewer staff members than usual doesn't immediately inspire confidence, and whatever happened or happens, I'm sure this remains an increasingly tough and worrisome time for the workers at CA. And despite my opinions on their franchise, nobody deserves to live in fear of being sacked for the profit motive of investors or managers who by all standards seem to be doing just fine. With all of this in mind, it's increasingly difficult to predict what CA might do in the future. Because as a rule, I think it's fair to say that fewer developers generally means less ambitious projects. Now while I'm not sitting with the numbers here, I think it's fair to assume that far less people than are currently employed at CA still made the beloved classics of Rome and Medieval 2 back in the day. And heck, perhaps even all the way up until Attila. In other words, CA could very well still accomplish great things with a smaller team. They've sure proven their capabilities in the past. But this of course doesn't immediately take into account that old projects are not the same as new projects, especially not in video games, and that game engines and developer studios need to be scalable for this to continue working. From everything we've heard out of CA's former devs, it seems the Total War engine, known as Warscape, has been so difficult and complicated to work with that the devs themselves are surprised and astonished that their own games are working. The impression I have is that Warscape by now, about a decade and a half after its inception with Empire, has become a patchwork of spaghetti code and broken dreams, updated just enough from game to game to provide a a somewhat new experience, but never truly managing to be revolutionary, never getting the series to take that crucial step forward. Now, how much of this is the engine's fault and how much of this is CA's own fault is debatable, and I personally have no answer to this. But it's not out of the confines of intelligence to assume that this is in part on the current CA devs, despite time limitations imposed by the managers. Because despite the fact that they must often dig up their own code and unlock the mystical language of the game engine by themselves, modders have managed to make things possible with this engine that CA devs themselves either never could or never bothered to do. Things that I personally have really wanted to see. An example of this is the population system in DI for Rome 2 or the 10 building slots in Medieval Kingdoms 1212 for Attila. Two factors out of many where modders have fulfilled the dreams of Total War players like me, but where CA has failed to listen quite literally ever since Medieval 2. In fact, the population system in DEI and MK1212 divides its people into classes, essentially creating their very own pop system, which Total War virtually never had officially, and one begins to wonder why. Because clearly, if modders can implement these features into a game engine they don't even have complete access to, it must by definition be possible for CA to do the same. Sadly, I think this fits very well into the idea that management at CA hasn't been what it should have been for a very long time, because clearly developers are doing what they can to meet release goals and to create new experiences that differ from the last. But that's also part of the problem. Not enough features are ever brought forward from a prior game, and core issues are almost never resolved. We're getting new coats of paint and a few new features, sure, but never an amalgamation of everything we've wanted to see in the same game. Of course, what I'm talking about here isn't 100% related to the latest sacking of employees, but I think it nevertheless is related. Related to a sense of disappointment and disillusion among a core part of the series fans, a part of why CA failed to live up to the other core part when it came to Warhammer, or that this lack of good judgment on behalf of CA managers resulted in the massive failed project and financial sinkhole that was Hyenas. Indeed, even in terms of the actual Total War strategy, they've failed miserably when it comes to their forgotten audience, the historical players, where both Troy and Pharaoh, games taking place in the Bronze Age, an era frankly most players have no or little relation to or desire to play or have ever asked for, came right after each other, and were both pretended to be for the historical audience first and foremost. It's sad to say, but it's hard to see what the future has in store for Total War, especially now that the company is losing manpower, when there have been no announcements or even rumors that tickle my particular fancy, and when the last few games over the past close to a decade has utterly failed to cater to me as a fan who used to be the core audience of this series, namely the historical one. But despite this failure, despite my hopes being let down over and over, it still hit me when the realization that CA might be no more appeared. Because the fact is that Total War isn't just one or two games, it's an idea, a concept, and a concept that could truly be reinvented time and time again, and made better time and time again. I mean, at one point in history it kind of did, and CA has loyal fans and supporters who want nothing more than for them to succeed again. But to do so while listening to all fans every now and then, not just the one section that's currently making the money. Following these latest firings and the news that CA is losing even more manpower, how do you feel about the future of the company and the Total War series as a whole? What's more likely, that CA and Total War go under, or that another publisher or buyer of sorts is interested enough to swoop in and invest in the series, the exact thing that just happened to Relic and their Company of Heroes franchise? Or will they remain with SEGA and become profitable again? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, I really hope you leave a like, a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Cheers!